Please help me in giving a strong welcome to Justin Lee.
I should just leave stage now. That's what I should do. Traditionally, this is the time where I come up and give kind of the uniting, basic Christian doctrine message. Those of you who've attended a number of GCN conferences in the past know that I tend to hit certain themes in my keynotes. There's a lot about the need to set our sights on Christ and forgive those who've hurt us as we've been forgiven, and to show mercy and to love our enemies and all this stuff. And I'm going to do some of that because it's important stuff. But I also am wondering if it's okay for me, maybe a little bit, to maybe step on a few toes this morning. Can I maybe? I don't normally do that. I normally try to be really uniting, but I thought, we've united everybody all weekend. Let's just divide people right now. Coke or Pepsi, go. Now, I'm just kidding. No, because I want to talk about two dirty words. At least they were dirty words in my church growing up. For a lot of you, they're not going to be dirty words, but for me growing up, these two words were dirty words, and I'll tell you what they are after these messages. I think it's important well, let me put it this way. If God is our great comforter, it's important for those of us who are not comfortable, those of us who are hurting, to get that comfort. Those of us who felt ostracized and rejected, we need that comfort. But those of us who are comfortable, and in whatever areas of our lives we're comfortable, I think sometimes God needs us to be uncomfortable. I think sometimes God needs to stir us up a little bit. Yeah? Okay. Because you look at Jesus, Jesus gave comfort to the sick, to the hurting, to the grieving, to the marginalized. But then when it came to those who were pretty happy with how things were, the Pharisees, Jesus stirs things up. The rich young ruler, he's pretty happy. He's like, I've got all I want. All I need is you just tell me, what do I need to do to have eternal life? And Jesus is like, oh, not much. Just sell everything you got. That's easy, right? So my hope is that this morning I can make you a little uncomfortable in areas of your life where you're already comfortable, but maybe offer some comfort in areas where you're not comfortable. You remember this song, those of you who are old enough to remember this song, From a Distance? Anyone remember that song? Yeah. I remember hearing this song on the radio. I was a kind of a sheltered Christian kid, and I remember hearing this song on the radio with this chorus, God is watching us, God is watching us, God is watching us from a distance. Mary Lambert, who? I know you all came just to hear me sing that. I remember hearing that, and I remember thinking, wow, I had never heard any songs about God on the radio. I mean, it was unless it was Christian radio, like if you listen to K-Love or something, then you get songs about God all the time. But I'd never heard a song about God on the radio, and I thought, that's really cool. And I said something to my mom. I was like, oh, I heard this song about God on the radio, and that's really cool. And she said, well, it's a nice song. What do you think? Is it a Christian conception of God? And I thought about that. I hadn't really thought about it. I just was excited they were singing about God, you know? It's nice to see people have a spiritual mindset. She said, do you think it's a Christian conception of God, that God is watching us from a distance? Is that a Christian conception of God? I don't think it is. The Christian conception of God is not that God is watching us from a distance, but rather that God is here in the midst of us, right? That God is an empathetic God. This is one of the things that distinguishes Christianity from, say, Greco-Roman myth. Greco-Roman myth, you have the gods somewhere else, Mount Olympus, watching from a distance. Christianity, we have a God who becomes human, lives among us, dies among us, experiences our experience, and comes to dwell in us. It's a very different idea of who God is. God is an empathetic God. I remember when I was, so, as many of you know, I'm bald. I know, it's a shock. I think someone just passed out in the front from shock. I have a genetic autoimmune disorder, alopecia areata. I first lost my hair when I was 4. My dad started a foundation to raise money to research alopecia. At the time, there was not as much known about it as is known now. And so when I was a teenager, there was a news crew that was doing a story on alopecia, and so they wanted to talk to my dad, and they wanted to talk to my family, and they wanted to talk to me. And I remember sitting there in front of these cameras, and I was just, you know, it's if you're not used to being in front of a camera and then somebody puts a camera in your face, it's like, and so I'm trying to be coherent, and I'm talking about what I learned from growing up with this disorder and being the bald kid in school and being different. And I said, well, I think one of the things I learned is I learned empathy. I learned to be empathetic to those who are, you know, on the outside. And as soon as I said it, I suddenly realized I wasn't sure if empathy was the right word. You know that moment like where you're talking, you're having a conversation, then you use a word, and then you're all of a sudden not sure if that was the right word? If you actually know what that word means, you think you do. You know? And so then you're kind of trying to fake it and hoping nobody calls you out on it. And then somebody's like, I've never understood, what does that word mean exactly? And then you're stuck and you're like, and what you're thinking is, I have no idea, I just said it to sound smart. But what you say is, you know, I don't know the exact dictionary definition of it. Maybe we could look it up. What do you think it means? So I had this moment where I said empathy, and then I thought, all of a sudden, I was like, wait, is that the right word, or did I mean sympathy? And I suddenly realized I wasn't 100% sure what the difference between empathy and sympathy was. I just heard both of them, and empathy felt to me like it was the right word for the context. So I said empathy, and then I'm still staring into the camera, and I'm kind of going, sympathy. Thankfully, it was an edited show, so that I didn't make it on the air, but I still remember that moment. It's one of those embarrassing moments that haunts you for the rest of your life. You know, you've got those moments, and the thing is, you think that nobody ever forgets these embarrassing things that happen to you, and everyone else is thinking about them, but no one else is thinking about them, unless you talk about them on stage in front of a crowd of people, and then everybody's thinking about them because you just said it. But empathy is the right word. Empathy is the word that I meant. Sympathy is like, sympathy is like, I feel bad that you feel bad, right? Sympathy is like, somebody's experienced a loss, something bad's happened, and they're in pain, and you feel bad that they're in pain, and so you give them a sympathy card, or you say, I'm so sorry, I want to express my sympathy. And that's a good thing to do, sympathy. But empathy is something else. Empathy is what Jesus did. Empathy is what the church reputation in our culture right now lacks. You know, you can feel sympathy when you are watching watching TV, if you're like me and you're still an old enough fuddy-duddy to actually watch TV, I talk about TV at work. Everybody in the office is younger than me, and whenever I say, oh my gosh, I'm so sick of this commercial, they're like, what's a commercial? I don't... And I'm like, on TV, and they're like, Netflix? But if you're watching TV and you see that commercial come on for, help the starving child in some region of the world, there's a starving child, and you can give money and help the starving child. And while you're seeing this image of the starving child, you feel bad. I hope you feel bad. If you don't, then, you're not even to the sympathy place yet. But hopefully you feel bad. That's sympathy. You feel sympathy. But unless you've actually experienced starvation yourself, or unless you know somebody really, really well in this commercial, you can't empathize. I cannot empathize with the starving child. I can sympathize all I want, but I don't know what it feels like. Empathy is being able to put yourself into the other person's shoes, to see the world through their eyes. And I can't do that because I don't know this person and I haven't experienced what they've experienced. Those are really the only two ways you can experience empathy. If you've experienced it too, or if you really know this person so well that you can be in their shoes. Sympathy you can feel from your couch watching TV. I feel sympathy for this kid. I feel bad. Maybe I'm moved to give money, maybe not. And then the commercial goes off and my program comes on and I forget about it. Jesus showed empathy because Jesus had both experienced the human experience himself and he knew the people he talked to. And he demonstrated that. I know you. I know what you've been through. I know your life. I care about you. That's empathy. Sometimes churches show sympathy without empathy, and it falls short. LGBT people in the audience, have you experienced churches wanting to show sympathy without empathy? There are those churches that don't even show sympathy, places where if you're an LGBT person, you just get preached at. Harsh language is used, you're treated as the worst of sinners. We've seen those churches, haven't we? Yeah? But then there are the churches. That I know some of you have been in, maybe some of you are in now, that do show sympathy. We love you. We want everyone to feel welcome here. But that's where it stops. And as an LGBT person sitting in that congregation, you don't actually feel understood. You don't actually feel that the other people in the congregation get where you're coming from, that they have experienced it or can see through your eyes, that they have empathy. They want to show love. They want everyone to feel welcome, but they haven't actually done anything that has made you feel welcome. The assumption is we just say everybody's welcome, and then everyone should feel welcome, and that's all we have to do, right? Some of you, that's touched a nerve, yeah? The problem is, these churches have this attitude that if you haven't been explicitly excluded, then you should feel welcome. If I haven't told you you're not welcome, then of course you should feel welcome. And doesn't it say in the bulletin, all are welcome? Oh, there you go. Done and done, right? But it takes more than just not being excluded to feel welcome. I talk to straight pastors all the time who are really good, wonderful people and say, I want LGBT people to be welcome in my congregation. Or sometimes they just say, I want gay people to be welcome in my congregation. And I say, that's great. And they say, I think people assume that they wouldn't be welcome, but they are welcome. We welcome everyone here. And I say, that's great. And they say, what else do you think we should do? And I say, well, I mean, what do the gay people, the LGBT people in your congregation think? Well, I don't know if we have any of those. Presumably they don't feel welcome. Or they don't feel welcome enough to be honest with you about who they are. It takes more than just not preaching at somebody. And so you as the LGBT person, or you as the family member of the LGBT person, or the friend or ally of an LGBT person, you know that something's missing, but they don't. That's what happens when you get sympathy without empathy. As Christians, we are called to show empathy. Jesus has this great story that we've all heard a million times, story of the Good Samaritan, in which Jesus is asked, "Who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus says, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." Now, if you've been in church for any time at all, you've almost certainly heard that story many times. And it's almost certainly been pointed out that the Samaritan, from the perspective of Jesus' audience, was not one of them. This was an outsider, a marginalized person from the perspective of his audience. And that this is part of his point. Oh, look, it was a good Samaritan, right? But it goes deeper because the guy says, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus' answer is not, "The Samaritan is your neighbor." Jesus tells a story in which the Samaritan is not the person who was wounded on the side of the road that the good person stopped and helped, but the Samaritan is actually the hero of the story, doing the work. The Samaritan is the one showing empathy. The marginalized person is the one who makes the effort to show empathy to someone else. And Jesus says, you be like that person. Not you show support to the Samaritan, you be the Samaritan. It's easy for us who have been hurt or marginalized to read the parable of the Good Samaritan and think about ourselves in the position of the man on the side of the road. We've been hurt, we've been beaten, we've been marginalized, and people are passing us by and they don't seem to care. But Jesus tells the story and says, be the Samaritan who stops and helps the other person. Be the marginalized person who cares about the other marginalized person who is marginalized in a different way than you are. According to Jesus, the question isn't who is my neighbor, but to whom will I be a neighbor? To whom will I be a friend? To whom will I be family? See, we are called to be allies to the marginalized and the hurting in our world. Not just allies, but neighbors. Not just neighbors, but friends, as Jesus was a friend of even the sinners. And aren't we all the sinners? Not just friends, but family, brothers and sisters. Not just family, but to love them as we love ourselves. It doesn't get any more intimate than that. And that's empathy, isn't it? To love someone as you love yourself. to see the world through their eyes and have that much love for them, it takes a lot of intimacy, more than sitting on the couch watching a commercial. Now, the thing is, almost everyone in this room has been marginalized in one way or another. If you think about it, I'm sure it won't take you long to think of a way in which you've been marginalized, a group in which you are the outsider, you are in the minority, you are the one whose voice is not heard. Just about everyone in this room can think of at least one, and maybe many ways in which you've been marginalized. It doesn't take us long to think about that. And yet it is also true that everyone in this room is, in one way or another, in some majority, in some position in which we have some kind of privilege that someone else doesn't have. Maybe because you're white. Maybe because you're cisgender. By now, at the end of this conference, I assume you know what cisgender means, but just in case you've been wondering all conference, cisgender is the opposite of transgender. So if you're not transgender, you're cisgender, which is the majority of the room. Maybe because you're able-bodied, because you can see, because you can hear, because you can walk, because you can run. In one way or another, you are in a majority. You have some kind of privilege or power that someone else does not have. So we must not be so focused on our own marginalization that we fail to care for others. And this is what brings me to those two dirty words, which I know you've been waiting for. Because in my church growing up, my evangelical church growing up, there were two words that I've heard since in a lot of other churches when I visit other churches, but we did not use in my church. And it may strike you as odd if you're from a church where these words are used a lot, but if you're from a church like mine where these words are not used, maybe you'll hear me on that. And those two words are social justice. Now, some of you are thinking, why would those be dirty words? Because growing up as a conservative evangelical, whenever I heard the words social justice, what I thought and what everyone I know of in my church thought was, that's what liberal Christians say. That's a liberal phrase. We were politically conservative, theologically conservative. We saw ourselves as conservative Christians. And social justice, to say that phrase, immediately identified you as coming from a different branch of Christianity. Now, it's not that we didn't care about social justice. Part of it is just language. We all have our own language. So I know if somebody is talking about the kinds of issues that we talk about at this conference and they just refer to our whole community as gay, I know one thing about them. And if they refer to it as LGBTQIA, then I know something different about them in terms of what circles they spend their time in, right? And so social justice identified you as an outsider. It's not that we didn't care, though. We did care. We did care about the poor, the hurting, the outcast. This is biblical. But I think part of the reason that we were afraid of that phrase, and part of the reason I knew that if I used it, there would be people on whose toes I was stepping, and I normally try not to do that, but I think it's really important. I think part of that is that as evangelicals, we wanted to make sure that our focus was on an eternal perspective. Evangelicals care a lot about heaven, about salvation through Christ. And so I think for many of us, there was a sense that if you spend a lot of time talking about social justice, then you're just focused on the here and now, and you're not concerned with an eternal perspective. So we didn't really talk about it. But I want to push back on that and say, I don't care if you consider yourself a conservative Christian or a liberal Christian or a moderate Christian or just a Christian and you think there shouldn't be any kind of adjective before that word. I believe social justice in whatever terminology we want to use to talk about it is something we've got to talk about because this is a Christian concept. It's biblical. Howard Thurman, the African-American theologian, wrote in 1949 a piece that has been a story that's been quoted many, many times since. It's powerful. You may likely have heard it before. But I think it's worth listening to because it's worth all of us hearing for ourselves and for others how Christianity sometimes sounds in the ears of those who've been marginalized. Thurman writes, "I belong to a generation that finds very little that is meaningful or intelligent in the teachings of the church concerning Jesus Christ. It is a generation largely in revolt because of the general impression that Christianity is essentially an otherworldly religion, having as its motto, 'Take all the world, but give me Jesus.' The desperate opposition to Christianity rests in the fact that it seems, in the last analysis, to be a betrayal of the Negro into the hands of his enemies by focusing his attention upon heaven, forgiveness, love, and the like. It is true that this emphasis is germane to the religion of Jesus, but it has to be put into a context that will show its strength and vitality rather than its weakness and failure. For years," he says, "it has been part of my own quest so to understand the religion of Jesus that interest in his way of life could be developed and sustained by intelligent men and women who were at the same time deeply victimized by the Christian church's betrayal of his faith." Ouch. He goes on, "During much of my boyhood, I was cared for by my grandmother, who was born a slave and lived until the Civil War on a plantation near Madison, Florida. My regular chore was to do all of the reading for my grandmother. She could neither read nor write. 2 or 3 times a week I read the Bible aloud to her. I was deeply impressed by the fact that she was most particular about the choice of Scripture. For instance, I might read many of the more devotional Psalms, some of Isaiah, the Gospels again and again. But the Pauline epistles, never. Except at long intervals, the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. My curiosity knew no bounds, but we did not question her about anything. When I was older and was half through college, I chanced to be spending a few days at home near the end of summer vacation. With a feeling of great temerity, I asked her one day why it was that she would not let me read any of the Pauline letters. What she told me I shall never forget. During the days of slavery, she said, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slaves. Old man McGee was so mean that he would not let a Negro minister preach to his slaves. Always the white minister used as his text something from Paul. At least 3 or 4 times a year he used as a text, "Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters, as unto Christ." Then he would go on to show how it was God's will that we were slaves, and how if we were good and happy slaves, God would bless us. I promised my Maker that if I ever learned to read, and if freedom ever came, I would not read that part of the Bible. It matters how we do Christianity in this world, not just in the next. Because too many people believe that the Christian faith is something that is built, designed to keep them down in some way. Many LGBT people, but many other people as well. And yet we hear Jesus telling us to pray, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Jesus is interested in heaven, certainly, but Jesus is interested in earth too. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, not just about the next life. And so I think social justice is important, caring for the marginalized in this life. And those of us who've been marginalized ourselves, we need healing from the ways in which we've been marginalized because many of us are still hurting. But also, we need to pay attention to the ways in which we can be allies, as the Good Samaritan was, to others who have been hurt and marginalized. This took me some time to figure out. I'm white, I'm male, I'm cisgender, I come from a reasonably well-to-do family, never had to worry about where my food was coming from, lived in a house in the suburbs, got a good education, I'm able-bodied. If I hadn't been gay, right? I mean, this is the thing that haunts me at night. If I hadn't been gay, would I have even been thinking about any of this? Right? Like, I want to believe that I would have. Like, I look at times in history where people were oppressed in ways even worse than now. I look at, for instance, the era of slavery, and I think to myself, if I had been there, surely I would have stood up for what was right. I want to believe that with all my heart. I cannot imagine allowing something so horrific to go on. And yet I look at my ancestors and realize they did not. And I want to believe that I'm better than them. But I don't know, and I don't know if I hadn't been gay, if I would be thinking about any of this. But because I have experienced what it is like to be on the outskirts, I have to care about people who are on the outskirts in ways that I'm not, or people who've been hurt or marginalized in ways that I haven't. I remember my fourth grade teacher had a poster up on the wall that said, "The more you know that you don't know." This is true. And the more we pay attention to the lives of people who are different from us, the more we realize this. The more time I spend with my trans friends, the more I realize how oblivious I am to what they experience on a daily basis. The more time I spend with the women in my life, the more I realize how much privilege I have as a man that I don't ever think about. And on and on. Growing up, I had lots of friends who were people of color. I had plenty of white friends, plenty of friends of various races. And I sort of thought racism was more or less over. I remember growing up hearing older white people bring race into conversations when there was no need to bring it into conversations. You know what I'm talking about? Where somebody's like, "Well, I was at the grocery store and there was a black man in front of me and he was talking real loud and taking his time." And I'm like, okay, wait. Why is the race of the individual in question so important to this story? Well, it was pretty clear to me why. Racism, right? So I naturally thought, as a white guy, the way to not be racist was to not ever talk about race. Yeah, I noticed that it was largely the people of color in the room who laughed at that. That's what I realized. That's what I thought. That's what I thought, is that I need to just not talk about race. I thought as long as I'm not talking about race, I'm proving that I'm colorblind and therefore the opposite of racist. Which is basically the equivalent of that church going, "All are welcome." Which is why, incidentally, if this hasn't been clear to you, the Black Lives Matter protesters get frustrated when people say all lives matter. It's not that they don't believe all lives matter. It's not that they don't believe all lives matter, but they're saying, wait a second, we're part of a community that is terrified that people don't treat our lives as mattering or as mattering as much, and we need specifically to affirm that Black lives do matter. I remember the moment in high school when I was sitting with an African-American friend of mine, and we were talking about race, and I said something about being colorblind, and he just looks at me and he's like, I don't want you to be colorblind. And I was like, what are you talking about? Of course you do. What? And he's like, no, my race is an important part of my experience in this world. My lived experience in this world is impacted every single day by my race. I don't want you to not see this part of me. It is part of me. What I want is not to be judged or treated poorly, but I want to be known. And it stuck with me, and I thought, and then years later when I came out and I had experience of people saying to me, well, I want to know you and I care about you and I love you, but do you really need to talk about being gay? I was like, oh, and a light bulb went on. I don't know what it is like to be a person of color in this country. I will never know what that is like. But there are moments when my own experiences of being marginalized in different ways give me little bits of insight, and I go, oh, this is what he meant. He wants to be known. And it's moments like that, over and over, that have consistently made me realize that the more I know that I don't know. And the more I need to learn. And the more interested I get in learning. And part of that is wrapped up in this idea that people who talk about social justice a lot talk about, they use another word that is like another liberal buzzword that sends people heading out of the room, and that is privilege. A lot of us, well, a lot of white people I know get frustrated with the word privilege. And the reason is that the word privilege, at least in my experience, has been used at some times, on some occasions, as almost a weapon. When people say, check your privilege, as if to say, there's something bad about you, something you should feel guilty about because you have privilege. But that's not the point of talking about privilege. It's not so that if you have some kind of privilege, you're supposed to feel bad and sit around feeling guilty and horrible about the privilege that you have. White privilege, male privilege, cisgender privilege. The point of privilege is not to say, oh my goodness, I am a cis white male, thank goodness I'm gay, or I would just be the worst person in the world. That's not the point, right? And then we look at the straight white cisgender men and go, you're the cause of all of the evil and the, right? No. No. We didn't choose the privilege that we have in these categories any more than others chose not to have it. The point, when somebody says you have privilege, the point of saying you have privilege is to recognize that you have advantages that other people don't. Now, it doesn't mean you have all the advantages. I was talking to somebody the other day who said, well, my grandparents were dirt poor and they had no social class and they had nothing. Where was their white privilege? Well, the point is not to say, oh, they must have been doing great because they went to the white privilege parties where everybody, drinks champagne and, caviar. No, of course. The point is to say, as a white person, there are times that I don't experience instances of racism that my friends of color do experience. And because I don't experience them, I'm usually not aware of them. And there is privilege in that. There are people who will listen to me who won't listen to Broderick or Allison or Misty. That's privilege. The point is not for me to sit and feel terrible about the privilege that I have, but to say, how do I use that privilege? I have the privilege that I can walk up the stairs onto this stage. If that privilege blinds me to the fact that not everyone can walk up the stairs onto this stage, then I won't know that we need a ramp when we need a ramp. But if I'm aware and if I'm paying attention, then I can speak up for and pay attention to the needs of my friends, my neighbors, who don't have the same privilege that I have. Speak up for, not speak on behalf of, right? So, the dirty little secret of the LGBT community, one of them. Are all those straight cisgender people out of the room? The dirty little secret of the LGBT community is we marginalize people a lot. Right? I mean, gay men have marginalized lesbians. Gay and lesbian folks have marginalized bisexuals. Right? LGBT folks have marginalized the trans community, right? They didn't get as many claps, you see? This is... And the thing about the LGBT community, and the reason that we have these long acronyms sometimes, is that as a community, we've kind of decided because we've been marginalized, we don't want to be the ones marginalizing others. And so we tell ourselves we're not going to do it, and then we do it anyway. And so we say LGBT and really mean gay men. And if you're not aware that that's ever happened, then either you're outside of the LGBT community or you're a gay man. There is tremendous racism in the LGBT community. People of color, speaking as a gay man, I can tell you, as a single gay man, if I go onto like a dating website and I look at what people say in their profiles, and just talking to my friends, people of color, gay men of color in particular, since my experiences as a gay man, men of color are either ostracized or exoticized and fetishized. Sometimes both at the same time. I was visiting a friend and he was showing me around the city that he lives in. And we were driving through the gay part of town and he says, here's a gay bar, here's the gay bar. And then we drove a little further, and then he says, here's the black gay bar, if you're into that sort of thing. Right? I wish I could tell that story as like, that was a one-time weird experience that happened. I cannot tell you the number of times I've heard white gay men casually drop racist comments. All the time. And then it's like, well, you can't help what you're attracted to. And I'm like, that's a whole separate conversation. But what you just said objectified a whole group of people as if they were like a food item. We're talking about people. Now, privilege is that I'm in the room when this happens and I have the opportunity to say something or not say something because I'm afraid and I don't want to lose a friend, right? And that's where, as Christians, we have to think about empathy. Gay men are terrible at objectifying each other. Straight men objectify women. Gay men objectify other men. Are you masculine enough? You might get marginalized if not. And the LGBT community marginalizes Christians, especially those from more conservative Christian backgrounds. And the Christian community looks at that and says, well, see, the LGBT community is not fair to us. And I say that's true. But the LGBT community is not representing a faith that is all about empathy, grace, and forgiveness. So frankly, I'm more concerned with making sure the Christians are doing it right. Now maybe you're sitting here listening to all this thinking, okay, but I'm not part of the problem. I know what it is to be marginalized. I don't marginalize other people. The question I have for you, however marginalized you already are, is when you think about other people in other marginalized groups, are you experiencing and showing sympathy or empathy? We all know the people who don't show either one. You know the people who say, I'm not racist. I would never use those kinds of words, those kinds of slurs. I would never call people that. But I have to say, and we just go, shh, 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 shh. I'm not racist, but does not go anywhere good. I don't have a problem with trans people, but shh. You've said enough. I mean, why do people from this group, why do they always, how come Mexicans are always, why is it every Asian I know? I mean, that's the definition of prejudice. You're putting everybody into a box and making a prejudgment about them, right? No. So we all know those people, but a lot of us think because we're not those people, or at least we tell ourselves we're not those people, that we're all good. And we're in that sympathy place where we kind of go, well, you know, we're all equal. We'll just treat everybody the same. I don't discriminate against anybody, so I'm good. We feel like I've done our duty. All are welcome. And essentially the problem with that is that I'm assuming if I do that, that what matters to me is what matters to everyone. If I feel welcome, surely everyone else feels welcome because what we need is all the same. I could walk up on the stage, so the stage is fine. I'm happy with the bathroom situation, so the bathrooms are fine. I feel welcome. We had gluten-free wafers available or bread options available for communion. And if you're, right? If that's not something you spend time thinking about, you might kind of roll your eyes and be like, oh, this political correctness. I have to have gluten-free now. But if you're one of my friends who's here, who has celiac disease or another reason that you need to be gluten-free, it makes a huge difference in whether you're welcome. It's like if we're running a meeting and I say, you know, let's take a quick 5-minute break. and all the guys get back on time, the women are still in line, right? I'm happy with the situation, so everybody should feel welcome, right? Without meaning to, we're saying as long as my needs are being met, we should all be fine. And what we fail to realize is that we have to go further because other people have other needs and concerns and feelings and experiences that are not our own, and so we have to listen to them. Loving our neighbor means more than just not hating our neighbor. It means more than just not attacking our neighbor. Do you notice that the people who show sympathy are the villains in the Good Samaritan story? The people who walk by and go, oh my gosh, that's a shame that that happened. I would never do that. I would never beat that person. That's a shame. Well, I'm late. There are the religious people in Jesus' story, interestingly, and they're the villains. How often are we those people? I told you I might step on your toes a little bit. I can't step too much longer because we've got to get out of here on time, but what the Bible calls us to do as Christians is not to feel sympathy for people and go, I would never do that. I would never call LGBT people those names. I would never use that racist slur. I would never make that sexist remark. What the Bible calls us to do is go a step further. James chapter 2 says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works? Can that faith save them? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." I love this passage. What good is that? Really? You feel bad? You feel sympathy? You would never do that? What good is that? We have to have empathy. So, what does this mean? What stops us from doing it? I think a lot of times, when we're not part of the marginalized group, we just don't recognize when something happens. If you're not in a wheelchair, then you don't recognize how far it is to get to the ramps or to get to where you want to go or all the things that you have to deal with until you are navigating it with someone in a wheelchair, and then suddenly you go, oh my gosh, this is terrible, right? If you're white, you don't realize how much racism continues to exist all the time, everywhere in the world. I had a friend share a story with me about racism that he'd experienced recently, and I was like, really? Really? That kind of stuff happens? I've never seen that happen. Does that really happen? And he's like, you're white. Sometimes what we do, there's conversation about in communities where racial justice is discussed a lot. There's talk of the PLEs, the perfectly logical explanations. It's easy for those of us in the white majority, and I think this applies to many other majority groups as well, to come up with perfectly logical explanations for why something happened the way that it happened. Somebody says, wow, I experienced such tremendous racism today at this restaurant where, the white folks got there after I did, but they were seated first. The server never seemed to care about our table, but they spent a lot of time at the white table. It took forever to get the food. It took forever to get the check. It was infuriating. And those of us who are white kind of want to go, well, maybe it wasn't racism. Maybe just the server was, a bad server. Maybe they knew the people at the other table. Maybe. We have all these perfectly logical explanations for why maybe it wasn't racism. I think we think we're being helpful. No, maybe the world is not a terrible place and it's not racism. Yay. How that feels to the person of color in that situation is, I don't care what you've experienced. I feel better living in my own little world where racism isn't a problem. And the thing is, for those of us who have not experienced it ourselves, it's really, really tempting to think that the world is a place where that kind of thing doesn't happen, because we haven't seen it. And we have also had experiences where we didn't get waited on in a timely fashion, where we had bad service, and so we think, well, maybe it is that. And you know what? Here's the thing about these perfectly logical explanations. Maybe in any one particular situation, maybe it was something else. But for somebody who experiences a pattern of discrimination all the time, they know a pattern when they see it. And they don't want to have it explained away. They want to be heard. And I can tell you, as a server who worked in a restaurant for 2 years, there is a lot of racism in the food service industry. And I heard people say, oh, that table that just came in, sat up in the pickup section, can someone else get them? And I would say, why don't you want to get them? You usually want to get every table you can. Wow. It's because they're black? Yeah, they don't tip well. It's because they're Indian? Yeah, they're a pain to deal with. I heard this stuff, and I talked to other friends who worked in food service in other parts of the country, and they've told me the same thing. So it's not in people's imagination. So here's what we can do. In whatever areas in which you have privilege, whatever areas in which you are in the majority, make time to look past the ways in which you have been marginalized yourself. And pay attention to the people who are marginalized around you. Raise the topic. Talk about it. Talk about it with your friends who are also in the majority with you. White people should be talking about what's going on in this country around Black Lives Matter. Racism, however, is not limited to just the African American community. All people of color in this country experience racism, and racism is a global problem. So we need, as members of the majority, to talk about this stuff. As cisgender folks, we need to talk about the needs of the trans community. And when we talk about these things, we need to talk about it as allies, not as critics of the movement. Not to talk about why we disagree with Black Lives Matter, but to talk about what's going on and why is it going on. And what can we do to make things better? We need to raise the subject with our friends who are in the minority as well. But in solidarity, not to critique them, not to force them to explain themselves, not to force them to defend themselves, not to force them to explain prejudice to us or their whole experience and represent a whole community by themselves, but to be willing to talk about it. I find that when I bring up some of these topics around my friends in marginalized groups, once they realize I'm not trying to get them to force them to say something, if it just comes up in conversation, I find that people open up about a lot of stuff that I don't normally hear as a white cis man. I think that we're all on the same page, and I find out we're not. Things are not so great. A black friend of mine and I were recently having a conversation. We were talking about race, and in the middle of the conversation, he stops himself and he says, I'm sorry for talking so much about race. We can talk about something else now. And I said, well, why are you sorry? It's a good conversation. Why are you sorry? And he's like, no reason. And I'm like, are you tired of talking about it? And he says, well, no. And I said, you think I'm tired of talking about it? And he says, well. I said, did I do something that made you feel like I was tired of talking about it? And he's like, well, in my experience, there's a limit to how much white people want to talk about race. And you know what? Growing up, I didn't talk about race a lot. I do now. Not as much as my friends of color. And I probably should. Same thing is true with sexism. I was meeting with a group of folks, and there were a couple men at the table, there were a couple women at the table, and I made a comment about meetings, and I said, it's interesting. I've noticed that often in meetings, if there are men and women at the table together, in many cases it's true that the men will talk over the women, and that it seems like many men, not all men, but many men we've been brought up to be assertive in meetings and jump right in with our opinion, and if other people are talking a lot, we try to find a way to push in, and that many women are more reluctant to do so, not all women, but I've noticed a pattern that it seems to happen a lot, that all the men have said something and none of the women have. And so I said this, and the women at the table, when I said this, and these folks all work together, and the women at the table are going, yes. And then one of the men said to one of the women, one of the men said to one of the women, oh, come on, I know you can jump in whenever you want. And I was like, Ixnay, danger, Will Robinson, danger, whoop, 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 not the right time. I get it, he's joking, they're friends, it's great, but she was really expressing in that moment feeling marginalized. And he wasn't hearing it. And I'm sure he's I talked to him, he's a great person. It's the kind of thing we all can do if we're not careful. Incidentally, I've had similar conversations with some of my friends who are not Americans about I had a conversation with a British friend of mine about the way that Americans have conversations and the way that the British have conversations, and the fact that, according to him, we don't ask a whole lot of questions and he always feels expected to jump in when he's not comfortable doing that. There are lots of these kinds of things that, unless we're paying attention and listening to people, we don't know. So, it's important for us to pay attention, to listen, not to speak for marginalized groups, but to lift up their voices, to put them on the stage, not to expect people to have to explain everything to us and represent a whole community to us, but to do research on our own, to read, to learn. Go find blogs. You want to learn about trans issues? Go read blogs of trans folks. You want to learn about the experiences of being Asian in America? Go read blogs. Don't sit your Asian friend down and be like, explain to me everything about... And use what we learn, and pay attention and bring attention to things that need to be brought attention to so that we can bring about a more just world for everyone. And if someone feels marginalized, don't look for the explanation to explain why. Just listen. I made that mistake. I talked to someone this weekend who expressed to me feeling marginalized at the conference. And my immediate reaction was to go, no, let me explain. And afterwards I thought, why did I do that? That was the wrong response. The right response was to listen. So, if you feel marginalized in whatever area of your life, remember, so was the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan is the hero of the story, with power to make a difference for others. And whenever you are in the majority, remember, your privilege that you have isn't something to be ashamed of, it's something to use. It's like the parable of the talents, to be invested and used. Don't bury it. Don't ignore that you have a platform someone else doesn't have. Don't walk by and feel sympathy for the marginalized person. Use what God has given you. Show empathy as God has shown it to us. And change the world with the manifest love of Christ. Amen.